So this is our Simondon reading group, continuing with our reading of Individuation, Volume 2, on the text History of the Notion of the Individual. By my notes, we are on page 603 of the PDF. So we're still on the section on Rousseau. So last time we continued, we had a short session last time, so we didn't go over that much material, but we looked at how the sort of paradox of the individual, the sort of duality of aspects within the individual, or this contradiction within the individual, for Rousseau gets realized in terms of a temporal duality. So Rousseau describes, when he's writing his autobiography, he describes his life as divided into two periods. So his youth up to the age of 30 or so, and he sort of makes the dividing line, the period when he starts publishing books and essays and so on, so around 30 years old, and then the next half of his life, so he's writing his autobiographical text in his 60s or so, and so the next 30 years or so of his life form the second period, which he considers to be a period of misfortunes in general. So he sort of looks back nostalgically on his youth as a period of happiness, and he looks back on the subsequent 30 years, the last half of his life, as being a period of misfortune. And we'll see a bit more on those misfortunes in today's reading, and how he sort of makes sense of them. Okay, so let's start with the reading on page 603. So I will read about a page or so. This stability, which permits one to be oneself, risks being destroyed by everything that unmoors the being from himself. Quote, my head, screwed up to the pitch of an instrument it did not naturally accord with, had lost its diapason. In time it returned to it again, when I discontinued my follies, or at least gave in to those more consonant to my disposition. End quote. New quote. I think I have already remarked that there are times in which I am so unlike myself that I might be taken for a man of direct opposite disposition. End quote. This will to be oneself corresponds to a need to define a firm attitude with respect to society. Quote, I consoled myself for my want of aptitude in conducting myself skillfully in the world, on feeling it as a science. On feeling it is a science we should not endeavor to attain. End quote. The attempts to adapt loosely, if not cleverly, to a society for which Rousseau is not made end in failure. The civilization of Venice, Lyon, Paris is foreign to his soul. All the efforts to make him no longer a cursed beast become exhausted in fairly ineffective expedients. Rousseau's nostalgia amidst, quote, pretentious people, unquote, is revealed to him when he sees, quote, a poor, simple bush of thorns, a hedge, a barn, a meadow, end quote. He would have then readily, quote, struck the face of Monsieur Leader and Monsieur Master, end quote. This liberation regarding social rules is symbolized by the sale of the watch, but there is also the need for a positive aspect to this reform, quote, thrown into the world in spite of myself, without having the manners of it, or being in a situation to adopt and conform myself to them, I took it into my head to adopt others of my own, to enable me to dispense with those of society, end quote. On the 26th of January, 1771, Rousseau writes to the Marquise de Saint-Chamond, quote, for 8 years I sought a soul among men. Now I no longer search for anything, and my lantern has faded, end quote. Nevertheless, even in this moment, Rousseau writes, quote, our most pleasant existence is relative and collective, and our self is not completely within us. For Rousseau, the idea of the conspiracy is not just an expression of a mental derangement. Rousseau does not want the conspiracy to use a completely false portrait of the character and life of the author as its principal means. There is a conspiracy of lies about the individual. The conspirators want to bury him alive. The League is this barrier between the individual and the world. Its goal is apparently to, quote, organize the inconsequentiality, end quote, of Rousseau's behavior. Through this reasoning of the imagination, Rousseau forces outside himself the aspects of incoherence that he feels in order to unify himself. He also forces outside himself the existence of what modern psychiatrists call the anxiety threshold, which prevents the subject from achieving even the simplest acts of life without feeling himself dangerously isolated and shut off in himself in some way. All the images Rousseau employs are characteristic of the mental states in which he finds himself at that moment. But the point that is most interesting here, in particular for the study of the individuality, is the following. Rousseau wants to somehow render his individuality coherent by simply forcing outside himself those aspects of inhibition that are revealed within himself. Since inhibition in its effects is completely similar to an external object, this transformation is easy. Furthermore, this inhibition is combined with the disorder of contradictory impulses which impede one another. Rousseau also accuses the League for this disorder so as to ward it off and force it outside himself in order to purify his individuality. Quote, their project, as I have told you, is to do a general recasting of all the anecdotes collected or made up by their satellites, to arrange them in a historical body disposed so artfully and worked out so carefully that everything absurd and contradictory, far from appearing to be a tissue of crude fables, will appear to be the result of the inconsistency of man. End quote. I'll stop here because this is a giant paragraph. So here we have Rousseau's explanation for this sort of duality or inconsistency of his character, which he attributes to this conspiracy against him. He sort of externalizes the inconsistency or incoherence of his personality onto this external conspiracy, and he takes it that this conspiracy or this league against him is sort of assembling all these anecdotes and different stories about him in such a way as to depict him as incoherent, as opposed to sort of recognizing that incoherence as part of who he is. And so this externalization is a sort of a strategy for, again, sort of splitting the self into the sort of real coherent self and the incoherent appearance, or the illusory incoherence that the conspiracy is sort of projecting onto him. And so again, it's a kind of splitting of the individual to preserve a kind of good half of the individual from the bad half that is sort of externalized.
I remember that in one of those sections in Psychic and Collective Individuation, Simondon talks about the importance of inhibition for trans-individual and collective life. And this passage on Rousseau and anxiety, I think, recalls the anxiety section in Volume 1. So I think it seems like there's this kind of, I don't know, like misfiring of the function of inhibition, the way inhibition is supposed to work in order to make collective life possible in Rousseau, that turns into it being externalized in this way.
Yeah, the bit about anxiety is definitely reminiscent of his discussion of anxiety in Volume 1. And so in Volume 1, he talks about anxiety as being a sort of dead end that where the processes that are supposed to continue into the collective individuation, continue from the level of psychic individuation to the level of collective individuation, are sort of individualized or are sort of stuck at the level of the individual, and the individual tries to sort of perform these tasks that are only really performable at the level of the collective, and anxiety is sort of the result of this incapacity to perform these tasks individually, and so here this anxiety is sort of used as the principle of this exteriorization. So there's a kind of the fact that Rousseau finds himself unable to perform the tasks of the social world in which he finds himself, to sort of integrate himself into the cultured society of France or wherever he finds himself. This inhibition or this inability to sort of perform as expected is sort of externalized, and this anxiety is sort of the motivation or the principle behind this externalization. So yeah, there's as we've I think suggested before, there's I think a lot of the discussion in the psychic and collective individuation part of Volume 1. We can find connections and parallels with his discussion of Rousseau here. And so what exactly the historical sequence of events was, whether he sort of found these ideas in Rousseau and then took them up for himself, or whether he was developing those ideas for himself and then found them in Rousseau. I'm not sure what the order of events was, but there's definitely this section on Rousseau is definitely one of the more important ones in the history of the notion of the individual in terms of how it relates to the content of Volume 1. Okay, so let's go on to the next section. If someone else would like to read.
I can read. So where did we leave off again?
So probably about a quarter of the way down on 604 after the quote. So beginning with, there is in this mythical idea.
Okay. There is in this mythical idea of the conspiracy a refusal to accept the knowledge and awareness of certain aspects of individuality. Should it be said that Rousseau's personality was richer in psychoses than a normal personality? That could be, but this procedure of the expulsion of inhibition and disorder is only livelier and more striking in Rousseau than in a less diverse man. In fact, this refusal to know oneself in one's entire multiplicity, which includes the totality of the coherent and the incoherent, with a certain connection between the coherent and the incoherent, is a testimony of human individuality. It is difficult to fully account for one's own incoherence and inhibitions without resorting to myth. Before resorting to myth, Rousseau tried to unify the different stages of his life in the form of destiny. But destiny, which substantializes the individual, cannot account for inhibition and disorder. The notion of destiny must be expanded to the point of making history as a whole intervene. The conflict between Rousseau and the conspiracy takes on the dimension of an epic, between religious intolerance and the philosophy of the Enlightenment, which is the religion of counter-religion. Rousseau appears as the champion of truth. And this truth is no longer a truth for a group, like the Jesuits or the philosophes, but a truth which, precisely because it is presented by an individual who is not a member of any community, presents within itself a guarantee of universality. Once again, myth is imbued with value and reconnects with the world by reaching the level of the epic of the mind. It is at this point that the whole individual being is conceived not just as unique, but as exceptional in every respect. Quote, I dare to believe that I am not like anyone who exists. My situation is unique. My case is unique since the world has existed, unquote. This exceptional aspect of the being accounts for the, quote, long chain of his misfortunes, unquote, that no long chain of reasons could arrange, but that takes on a meaning according to fatality. However, this latter explanation, which safeguards both the personal unity and infinite diversity of acts and aspirations, is not completely satisfying. Individuality always reappears as a paradox. It appears under fatal necessity, and correlatively, it deploys the feeling of the unique, indeterminate character of an instant. What creates necessity is the instant, and not perhaps a supernatural destiny sketched out for all eternity. Blind necessity emerges in the course of events. Quote, and from that moment I was ruined. All the rest of my misfortunes during my life were the inevitable effect of this moment of error, unquote. Even the happy time of his life at L'Ermitage, which lends itself to the sweetness of remembrance, is called, quote, the terrible and fateful era of a fate unparalleled among mortals, unquote. In contrast, alongside this determinism that has emerged from a contingent moment, the determinism of personality manifests that is so strong and clear that it permits reconstructing the unfolding of life rationally based on the hypotheses of this personality, in the same way that Condillac forged the constructive synthesis of sensations and ideas in the statue. Quote, judge whether he could have escaped from the convergence of these different causes that made him what he is today. To get a better sense of this necessity, let's set aside all the facts for a moment. Let's suppose that the only thing known is the temperament I described to you, and let's see what would naturally result from that in a fictional being about whom we would have no other idea, unquote. Here the ambivalence still remains. Natural determinism is also a moral force that has all the characteristics of providence. Quote, the man of nature learns to bear in everything the yoke of necessity and to submit to it, never to murmur against providence, which began by filling him with precious gifts, which promises to his heart gifts more precious still, but which, in order to repair the injustices of fortune and men, chooses its time and not our own, unquote. So it seems like the kind of core of Rousseau's problem here, I guess, is that he keeps trying to substantialize himself in one way or another, doing this by trying to understand his life in terms of destiny, but this doesn't account for the incompleteness of the individual, which I guess is constitutive for the individual for Simondon. And so that's why destiny has to turn into this world historical conflict, when he externalizes these inconsistent aspects.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think Rousseau sort of is an exemplar of this impossible task of sort of constituting the individual as this completed, sort of coherent totality. Whereas for Simondon, the individual exists only through its individuation and this sort of continual process of unification, which is never completed. And there's always this remainder of the pre-individual within the individual. And so for Rousseau in particular, he has all these sort of discontinuous or incoherent tendencies, these sort of disjointed features of his personality that he keeps trying to find a way of accounting for in terms of a coherent totality. And so every attempt sort of requires him to externalize some other factor or other element and posit it as being something outside of himself. And so this notion of destiny or providence comes up a few times in his autobiographical writings, where he sort of depicts himself as being sort of picked out to have a particular career, and then the sort of variant that Simondon points to here is where he sort of instead of being selected by providence for a particular career, it's instead that his temperament or his personality sort of contains his whole life history embedded within it, and his life history is a sort of working out of his original temperament or dispositions. So these are sort of variants that Rousseau presents in different parts of his autobiographical writings, but they both have this sort of character of being a totality, a coherent totality that is only that it has to externalize anything incoherent. One bit that I was going to add to here is when that might be obscure, is when Simondon mentions here Condillac and the statue. So there's a book by Condillac from around the same time as Rousseau was writing in the late 18th century. I think it's the Essay on Sensations, or I forget the exact title, but anyway, where Condillac presents his account of his empiricist account of the development of the human mind in this sort of fictional circumstance of a statue, and he considers adding sensations of various kinds to this statue, and what sort of mental life the statue would have if it only had the sense of touch, for example, and then adding more different types of sensations, and how those sensations sort of build up a complex mental life. So that's what that bit about the statue means here.
I was just thinking, like, the strange thing about Rousseau is that even though this conception of himself that he had seems, like, obviously is grandiose and paranoid and unreasonable, but at the same time, like, it does seem like his personality was kind of the motor behind his writing all of this stuff. And, we are still talking about him 200 plus years later. So he wasn't entirely wrong, I think, in thinking of himself in that way. But he sort of, like, it becomes right because he had this grandiose self-conception.
Yeah, there's I think there's a lot of different things we could sort of take into consideration in analyzing why we're still reading Rousseau 200 plus years later, and why he's still of interest. So one factor is the way that he sort of brings together a lot of the different currents of the time and sort of incarnates the sort of 18th century sort of anti clerical tradition and anti monarchical tradition, which feeds into the French Revolution. That some of the conservative critics of Rousseau and of that tradition have sort of blamed him for the French Revolution and said, his ideas were sort of the one of the factors that led to the French Revolution, and that's probably an oversimplification. But he sort of he's one of the people, and along with people like Voltaire and Diderot, who sort of express some of the ideas that are brought to fruition in the French Revolution. A few years later, and then there's also at the same time, I think what is unique about Rousseau in comparison with some of the other writers of that era is the way that he sort of points to the Romantic school or tradition that develops a little bit later, and so his valorization of feeling over reason, and his sort of nature worship, and some of the other elements of his thought point towards the Romantic tradition that develops later in the 19th century, later in the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. And so he's at the same time sort of one of the sort of incarnations of the Enlightenment tradition of the 18th century, but he also points beyond that to the Romantic tradition of the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century. And so there's like this sort of dual character or this dual value of his work that we can read in either of those contexts, which I think is still of interest today.
I'm thinking like the first part of what Angus has just read, like the mythical idea of a conspiracy to kind of like the multiplicity versus like a totality and universality and something like that. And then what catch my eyes was like myth or destiny. Because the other day I talked with my colleague about the Anti-Oedipus, like that's chapter 3 and then section 5, something like that. That part exactly talked about like destiny and the fate, something like that. Like that's the part of like talking about that. But at the same time, like it brings up of the idea of fate and then destiny, something like that. So it was quite interesting. In this Simondong's writing, like it's like a destiny was used to represent like some kind of accumulation of individualities, which like comes up as a kind of a totality or universality, which might have been like adopted as a kind of the particularly in religion, something like that. So, yeah, interesting. Like this part, like, I'm just wondering, like it could overlap like a part with a part of the Anti-Oedipus at the same time.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly what they say in Anti-Oedipus about myth there, but there's some interesting passages in Difference and Repetition where Deleuze talks about how or maybe it's Logic of Sense, I can't remember, but Deleuze talks about how Plato sort of has recourse to myth at various sort of key points in different dialogues. So like in the Phaedrus, when he's talking about the immortality of the soul, he gives a sort of myth of how the soul selects a life to incarnate or to take shape in. And in the Republic, we have the myth of the cave and the the vision of the forms on the cave wall and so on. And so in all these dialogues, there's a sort of key point where Plato introduces a myth, and I think here the role of myth is to sort of grant a kind of coherence to a life in a way that it wouldn't have otherwise. So the myth has a sort of narrative structure. It has a beginning, middle, and end that have some sort of continuity or coherence to them. And so by sort of projecting this myth onto your life, you present it as a kind of coherent story as opposed to just a contingent set of circumstances or a set of accidents that happen to this particular person. And so understanding yourself in terms of the conflict between religion, religious intolerance, and freedom of thought, or something along those lines. This sort of depiction of yourself as part of a world historical process allows you to make your life history coherent and sort of put your life history in terms of a story that makes sense. And so I think that's sort of the role of myth here in Rousseau's use of these terms of like destiny, providence, and so on. But we can also think of the way at the beginning of this text, the history of the notion of the individual, how Simondon points to the role of the artisan as sort of disrupting the realm of myth and being one of the key factors leading to the development of philosophy, because like in ancient Greek society, say in 700 BC or 800 BC, somewhere in the sort of pre-philosophical era, we have mythical explanations for the world. Thunder is brought about by Zeus, and so on. We have different stories that explain natural phenomena in terms of the will of the gods. And the artisan for Simondon is, because he has this access to the world that sort of short circuits or goes around the social realm of myth, sort of incorporates or connects the individual to the natural world in a way that is independent of myth. And this is sort of the origin of philosophical / scientific explanation of the world, as opposed to mythical explanation of the world. So I wonder if here this sort of mythical sense of the self, or this depiction of the self in coherent terms through myth, would also in some way be subject to a kind of interruption by a more direct contact, or a contact that doesn't pass through the social order of myth and narrative, and that would allow for some sort of explanation of an individual's biography without having recourse to concepts like destiny or providence and so on.
Well, thank you so much for a good explanation. So, kind of at the same time, this kind of thing is like related to Spinoza and God, like who could embrace like all contradictions, all kind of like irrational representations of the things, behaviors, or something like that. But my question is like, Rousseau seems to like they are beyond that. I mean, what I mean is here, maybe like there must be some limitation of the era, a time, like 18th century is like the right after the era of God, and then the humans like enlightenment is like goes on, I mean went on, but the still like I think like a human's agency or things within the frame of the word of God. So Rousseau is trying to like I mean, he's a kind of like person. Imagine it's like the weirdo, like overcome. No, like going beyond that. But maybe like he was still like a was and then kind of stayed like in the shackles of the era. I'm just wondering, like Simondon might have brought him as a kind of example of person who, I mean, transcendental figure of all kind of the rules, the God's rules, like things like humans the will, or humans like the autonomy or agency altogether represented through like Rousseau.
Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion, because I mean, not to sort of take us too far afield, but when you bring up Spinoza, I recently read the book by Knox Payton, Spinoza contra Phenomenology, which is an interesting book about the history of French philosophy in the 20th century, and this sort of Spinozistic tradition, this rationalist tradition, that including Deleuze as part of this Spinozistic tradition, and there's a bit in that book when he's talking about Althusser and his sort of Spinozistic version of Marxism, where he quotes a bit from Althusser where he says that sort of this I think it's from the 60s, where he says that the sort of intellectual project is to not tell oneself stories anymore. So not to sort of represent the world in terms of stories, or myths. We could also sort of translate that in terms of myths. And so there's this sort of Spinozistic project of finding a way to understand the human world without having recourse to myths. And this is and so for Spinoza in himself, there's a whole sort of conflict with what he calls superstition. So depictions of God as a stern judge or a father who punishes people for doing wrong and rewards people for doing right. So this whole picture of God for Spinoza is a sort of superstitious one that is only is sort of adapted to human understanding as opposed to a rational understanding of God. And yeah, so I think we can sort of look at Spinoza and other writers who have been inspired by Spinoza as having this sort of opposition to myth and opposition to stories as a way of understanding the world, and trying to develop a sort of rational conception of the world in terms of the order of causes for Spinoza. And yeah, so there's a sort of project of reconceiving of the world without having to use myth or stories.
Yeah, maybe like it would come again like later. So yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, good. Thank you.
Yeah, the point about myth makes me think of Volume 1, and in the collective individuation section where he distinguishes between myth and I think it's myth and either belief or opinion. Where he seems to say that myth is sort of like this kind of internal affective life of the group, something that doesn't really need to be explained, but these, I don't know, shared feelings or assumptions about the world that aren't really translated externally when the group needs to justify itself, but the group justifies itself externally in terms of beliefs, which are not ideas that it would have to formulate, one group member to another, because they already have these shared assumptions and only appear when the group is kind of challenged from outside. I don't know where that would put Simondon in the Spinozistic rationalist tradition you were talking about.
Yeah, he. I think it is belief that he talks about as being sort of the individual, like in the case of an individual person, as opposed to myth as being the collective phenomenon. And yeah, so he, if I remember correctly, he said something like, we only have beliefs insofar as we're already sort of challenged, or insofar as the sort of collective representation of the world is already subject to contradiction in some way. So myth is the collective sort of representation of the world, which doesn't need to be explicitly stated or explicitly set out in a text or in a story that is told orally. It's just the sort of average understanding of the world that people who belong to this particular group will have, and then it's only once this sort of understanding of the world of that group is confronted with an alternate understanding of the world in another group, or some sort of internal fracture or something like that, that this myth starts to be takes on the form of belief as a sort of explicitly stated proposition. And we can think of like in the sort of ancient Mediterranean world, there's Greek religion that has this pantheon of gods that have different properties and so on. And then we can think about like Herodotus travels around the Mediterranean world, and he always he finds these different religious practices in different parts of the world, and he sort of identifies the gods of other peoples with the Greek gods. He says, this people worship Hercules and or this other people worship Zeus in this way or whatever.
Right, yeah, like Zeus wears these clothes over here for some reason.
Yes, exactly. So he always assimilates the foreign gods to the Greek gods, and with Herodotus, there's a sort of a partial depiction, I guess, of or a partial transition from myth to belief, in the sense that he starts to recognize that there's a difference between the way that the Greeks understand natural phenomena and the world in terms of their pantheon, and then the way that other peoples represent the world. But he sort of his way of understanding that difference is by sort of mapping the beliefs of other people onto his own beliefs. But then we have in the more, I guess, rationalist tradition within Greece, within ancient Greek philosophy, there's was it Xenocrates, or I can't remember now his name, but anyway, he makes the statement that I think got him into trouble, that the different peoples depict the gods in their own image, and so the Ethiopians depict the gods as having dark skin, whereas the Greeks depict the gods as having light skin, and so on. And then he also holds that astronomical bodies are just stones, or are not divine in any way. And so there's this sort of counter superstition or counter mythical tradition that already begins in ancient Greek philosophy, and we see in the Epicurean school in particular. This was like a sort of one of the key ideas or key motivating principles, was to counter superstition and sort of free humans from superstition. And for Simondon, I think I don't think he takes on that project for himself. I don't think he wants to sort of counter superstition. I think he wants to sort of account for the reality of myth. So what is it that is expressed in mythical thought or mythical self-understanding of the world? So what aspect of the world is grasped when the world is depicted in mythical terms? So yeah, I think Simondon is kind of outside of that rationalist anti-superstition tradition, and so he's not a Spinozist in that sense. Okay, so that was a sort of a digression from the text, but let's come back to the text and read the next section. If Ali, would you like to read?
Yeah, sure. Is that the same aspect of paradoxical?
Yes.
Oh, all right. The same aspect of a paradoxical contradiction, the solution of which posits again a new problem from within itself, is revealed in Rousseau's art of living. To flee from men and to be seeking them out, to have written deep within one's heart and the need for a friend, and to be unable to keep any. These are ethical contradictions. All these contradictions are summed up in the reciprocity of life and death. Quotes. I can indeed say that I only began to live when I regarded myself as a dead man. End of quotes. At this point, Rousseau would like to destroy a part of himself. Quotes. Reason kills me. I would like to be mad as well as to be healthy. End of quotes. Exile is anticipated as a means of accessing the existence of Robinson Crusoe. Quotes. It has come to me 100 times to propose traveling to America, hoping that I would be left in peace. I would like to find some way to end my life in the island of the archipelago, in Cyprus, or in some other parts of Greece, provided I find an agreeable climate, fertile in plants. End of quotes. Failing in exile, the passionate preoccupations of life become the fundamental methods for the art of living, particularly botany and music. Rousseau gives an incredible amount of attention to botany. He asks for a microscope and goes on excursions that are sometimes painful, like the excursions to Mont Blanc from Montguin His letters to Madame de Ressort show the extent of depth of Rousseau's knowledge, as well as the painstaking nature of his methods of observation. Through this effort, Rousseau is convinced that he can escape from madness and disorder. Quotes, his preoccupation is worse to a walking machine, which is prohibited from thinking. Unable to leave my head empty, I want to stuff it. It must be full of hay to be free, and to without fear of being discreet. End of quotes. Similarly, the taste for music is active in Rousseau, who plays the zither and tries to rediscover the romances of Geneva, which he sings, so he says, quotes, with a broken voice. End of quotes. His tastes, particularly that of botany, are consequently an affair of reason. End of quotes. At the same time, Rousseau attempts to discover a doctrinal truth that does not aim at universality, but can be perfectly suitable for the individual. Quotes, I adopted in each question the feeling which seemed to me the most directly established, the most credible in itself. It is important to have a sense of self, to choose it with all the maturity of judgment one can manage. End of quotes. Rousseau wants a doctrine that conforms to inner assent. Quotes, so solid, so appropriate to my reason, to my heart, to my whole being, and reinforced with the inner assent that I feel lacking in all others. End of quotes. Consequently, it is no longer intellectual life that is the deployment of the individual and that affirms him as a worker of universality, but, on the contrary, the individual who seeks a philosophy that's well adapted to him. It is this point, in particular, that marks the position between the conception of individuality in the 17th century and Rousseau's conception of his own individuality. Furthermore, according to Rousseau, reason can be acknowledged the existence of an order superior to it. Quotes, I cannot prevent myself from the handfuls considering as one of those secrets of heaven, impenetrable to human reason, the same work that until now are looked upon as only a fruit of wickedness of men. End of quote. The supernatural force is sometimes envisioned according to the modality of an Eastern fatalism, sometimes according to the forms of Christian providence. This is because in the belief in destiny and providence, there is acceptance of oneself. Quotes, reduced to myself alone, I nourish myself. It is true, my own substance, but it does not run out. I am sufficient unto myself. End of quotes. Here, the distinction between amour propre, and self-love intervenes, just as within the reverie, the distinction intervenes between the self we leave behind the true self we enjoy, relative to which nothing is external, the which est. Bacon, in L'âme romantique et le rêve, characterizes by saying, quotes, absolute self-consciousness here is conflated with what we call the unconscious. End of quotes. Stop here. We'll continue.
Yeah, that's a good place to stop. Thanks.
You're welcome.
So here we have this opposition between reason and feeling that I alluded to earlier in Rousseau, where he tries to, or he sort of sets himself up as being a person of feeling as opposed to a person of reason, and he considers feeling to be superior to reason, and he has a sort of dream of freeing himself from reason and sort of relying on feeling. And in doctrinal questions or questions of philosophy, he also wants to rely on feeling as opposed to reasoning. But at the same time, despite some of these pronouncements and the passages that Simondon quotes here, Rousseau also was closely associated with the rationalist philosophy of the 18th century. He was friends with Diderot, and he contributed articles to the Encyclopédie. And he, at one point, was working on a textbook of chemistry that was like 1,000 pages long or something like that. It was this huge textbook of chemistry that he never finished, but he wrote all kinds of stuff on chemistry. And so he despite his sort of skepticism of reason and his privileging of feeling, he still kind of participates in the life of reason in those ways. And so this is just another aspect of the sort of contradictory nature of his personality, or this duality of aspects of his personality. Yeah, he's definitely an interesting person. There's there's the famous line from Whitman, I contain multitudes. I think is the line. I'm probably quoting it wrong. This idea that contradiction is something that sort of enriches a personality, that a personality can contain contradictory aspects, and that is not sort of a weakness of personality, but a sort of richness of personality. And so this is also, I think, probably new with Rousseau, and is sort of contributes to the romantic tradition that follows. I don't think any earlier authors, or at least I don't know of any earlier authors who would sort of depict contradiction of personality, or this incoherence of personality as part of a richness of personality in the way that Rousseau does. Okay, so we.
Sorry. Whoso in that sense, like the multiple characters or personalities, kind of, can you like compare that to like the mythology, Greek mythology, like a Zeus, like, or like the god and all the statement, because like everything is in there, like very whimsical and then very fluctuating at the same time, like seeking for the kind of virtues, and then something like that, very individual, very collective, all the things like in one person, like.
Yeah, that it reminds me when you mention sort of trying to connect this with the Greek gods. There's a passage in Fire Advent. I don't think he's the one who sort of came up with this idea, but I remember reading it in Fire Advent, where he talks about this argument that ancient Greek worlds, like the people of the Homeric era, more or less, didn't sort of conceive of themselves or experience themselves as unities in the way that maybe modern people do. So there was no sort of notion of consciousness or of a sort of unified experience in the way that we are sort of familiar with today in the, I guess, post-Cartesian world. And one of the pieces of evidence that he gives for this sort of lack of unity of the ancient Greek mind was the way that in Homer, all the different sort of emotional responses of people are depicted as gods that appear to them. Like there's a passage that I think Simondon actually quotes this passage in Volume 1, where a dream is like the dream is comes to the person and sits at the bottom of the bed and sort of arrives to the person from outside. And then we have other passages where Achilles gets angry, and this is depicted as Ares. Ares sort of appears to him and like instigates him to anger, or instigates him to some sort of violent act. And so all these different emotional responses that the people are depicted as experiencing are always presented as like something that the gods infuse into them or bring to them from outside. And so this is taken to be a sort of representation of the individual with that doesn't have a sort of coherent unity, but that is subject to these sort of external phenomena, and these different aspects of the individual are sort of presented as these different gods or these different principles that arrive to the individual from outside. And so this is this sort of incoherence of the individual, or this presentation of the individual as being made up of these multiple factors that don't have a sort of intrinsic unity to them, I think is something that Rousseau sort of picks up on. But at the same time, there's always this sort of striving for unity with him that we see in some of the passages that Simondon quotes. And it's this, and the sort of paradox is that it's this striving for unity and a striving for coherence that results in a splitting of the personality into, the life of the young man versus the life of the older man, or the true self versus the self that the conspiracy is projecting onto it. And these, so it's the striving for coherence that brings about this sort of splitting of the individual. And so I think we can certainly compare this sort of multiplicity of the personality of Rousseau with this sort of argument about the lack of intrinsic unity in the ancient Greek mind. However, whether we find that convincing or not, but it's a similar type of situation, whether or not it's accurate about depicting the ancient Greek mind.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. Actually, one thing just to mention in terms of formatting here is that in the French text, there's a line break and this sort of italicized heading, which I think is indicating a section break. So I think we're supposed to read this next bit as the next couple of paragraphs, about a page or so, as not being part of the Rousseau section, but as being a transition to the next section. But the English translation, for whatever reason, doesn't include that line break. So it's the distinction between the sections is not quite as obvious. But I think we are meant to read this as a line break. Would someone else like to read from The Search for Individual Reality?
Yeah, I can read. The search for individual reality in the 18th century occurs by way of a deepening of the being's concrete singularity. But this deepening of singularity leads to a splitting as pronounced as the bisubstantialist dualism of the 17th century. The individual is found to be inhibited by himself, and his search for freedom collides with the barrier that he himself is, just as his desire for plenitude collides with this interior emptiness of the being who feeds on his own substance. The interior duality and the presence of the other resurge from within, posing problems different from those that appeared in the 17th century, but with an analogous internal dynamic, as if the problem of individuality were always the same in its source, throughout various intellectual and social circumstances changing from age to age. In the 18th century, deism appears as an aspect of a general tendency that consists in the individual's search for all the elements of his moral and intellectual life, in his experience and his reasoning. Deism is therefore opposed to this quote-unquote true religion to which François de la Chambre consecrates his treatise of 1737. There is nothing more desirable, quote, there's nothing more desirable either for princes or for societies or for the particulars that compose them, unquote. For princes, as the, quote, motive of keeping people in duty, unquote. For societies who find in God avenging crimes a stimulant to virtue, for those who find in God a consoler. Deism and atheism are associated based on all the protests in favor of tolerance, all the reformational tendencies, while the deists' adversaries assert the value of social police and the means of government. Deism is associated with empiricism and individualism. Quote-unquote inner feeling is in fact a strength of the individual. The morality of feeling that develops in the 18th century also affirms the value of individual consciousness. Thus, Shaftesbury believes in natural social inclinations, which are for each individual being directed toward the good of the species. These inclinations are the work of a providence that maintains through them the perfect harmony of universal order. Man possesses a quote-unquote moral sense that makes him aware of good and evil. In 1725, Hutcheson systematizes these ideas in his inquiry into the original of our ideas of beauty and virtue. For Hutcheson, there is a quote-unquote moral sense that truly deserves the name sense, since it does not presuppose any innate idea. Diderot brings these ideas relative to the moral sense into France by translating Shaftesbury's An Inquiry Concerning Virtue or Merit. In England in 1723, the fable of the bees, or private vices, public benefits, expands the vision that Mandeville developed in 1705 on the topic of the rapport between individual morality and collective life. Even private vices can contribute to the smooth functioning of society, which in this sense so often depends on non-virtuous foundations. This work exerted significant influence throughout the 18th century, not via the rigorism that drives Mandeville, but due to the schematism that it contains and that opposes it to Hobbes' thesis on authority. Individualist ethics is particularly prominent in Wolff's thought. His essential rule is reminiscent of Kant's. quote, do what makes you and your neighbor more perfect and abstain from the opposite, unquote. This individualist and naturalist ethics does not acknowledge any authority other than the reasoned knowledge of what we are. The correlative of this ethical conception is a geometrical vision of the universe in which the whole is composed of collaborating individuals. The representation of society leads to the political theory of enlightened despotism. A liberal individualism is completed by a state which, to maintain unity, regulates the life of individuals down to its finest details. This providential sovereign compels its subjects to work and to save, and it takes measures against deism and atheism. However, Vico and Montesquieu did not completely reduce human reality to the activity of individuals. Furthermore, the authors of natural series have understood specific realities. But perhaps, say Vico, these authors elaborated a social static equilibrium and a biological static equilibrium rather than corresponding dynamic equilibria. However, a static equilibrium seems to be able to be superposed onto a dynamic theory of individual reality without modifying it. These thoughts have remained somewhat independent from the conception of the individual and have not become the universal systems that they could have been if they were dynamic equilibria. It is only later that these social and biological dynamic equilibria will have considerable importance for the theory of individual reality. Yeah, this section is super dense, but is this idea, the various theories of kind of the possibility of social life on the basis of the private actions of autonomous individuals. Is he saying that this is what leads to this kind of social static equilibrium as opposed to a dynamic one because it starts from these already constituted individuals?
Yeah, I think that's part of what he's arguing here. So there's a book which I have not read, but which is often cited. I believe the author is C.B. Macpherson on possessive individualism, and so he sort of identifies this tradition primarily in Anglophone philosophy, but that also travels to France in the 18th century of what he calls possessive individualism. So it's a depiction of the individual as essentially a property owner, and to be an individual is to have property, and societies are sort of founded on the basis of the right to own property, and the sort of purpose of a society is to protect the property of the individual, and so this is a common sort of trope in the ideas of British writers of that era, and then later French writers. And there's so this section is a very quick sort of overview of the whole 18th century, more or less. But I think what he is suggesting here is that that by sort of isolating the individual and trying to treat the individual in isolation, and then sort of adding on how those isolated individuals sort of create the collective life. In doing so, you sort of paint yourself into a corner where it becomes impossible to sort of to understand the real history of social life. And so he points to Vico and Montesquieu as two people who didn't perform this sort of reduction, and they're precisely people who try to develop a historical account of societies and how they arise and how they transition from one form to another and so on. But there's a sort of tendency to treat societies as a static equilibrium, so as a sort of social order that is not supposed to change. And then the question is just how do the sort of private actions of individuals reproduce this social order and ensure its continuity? And then the sort of practical question is, what should the prince, the enlightened despot, what should he do to ensure that the social order remains stable? And then, so this whole conception of the world, or conception of the social order, sort of presupposes that stability is desirable and is the sort of the principle that the social order should be governed by. Whereas what we find in later social philosophy or writers on the social order is a sort of dynamic, progress-oriented conception of the social order, where the idea is that the social order should develop over time and become excessively better, or in some sense more perfect over time. And so this is like the 19th century sort of evolutionist in the broad sense of the term conception of social order. And so we'll see more on this opposition later, I think, when we get to the 19th century section of this text. But yeah, there's this opposition between a sort of static conception of the social order made up of sort of atomic individuals on the one hand, and then a dynamic conception of the social order that involves some sort of progress or intrinsic development of one social order into a future one. And I'll just add to that as a sort of preview, I guess, of what we're going to see in the 19th century section. But of course, Simondon, in setting up this kind of opposition between a static and a dynamic conception of the social order, will want to sort of overcome this opposition. And we already saw some of this in Volume 1, where he criticizes both treating the individual as already constituted and then secondarily being sort of connected to other individuals in some way that is supposed to bring about the social order. But he also criticizes conceptions of the social order as being a kind of collective substance that exists independently of the individuals or over and above the individuals in some mysterious way. And so the sort of dynamic conception or the progress or evolutionist conception of social order that I mentioned just a minute ago has the sort of risk or the danger of falling into that substantialist conception of the social order, where you depict like and maybe Hegel would be like the one of the exemplars of this, where you depict world history as a sort of succession of these collectives of different peoples that sort of realize different philosophical principles, and there's this collective substance that is sort of transitioning from one era to the next, and this is a kind of substantialist depiction of the social order that Simondon also wants to reject, and he wants to find a conception of collective life that doesn't either start from already constituted individuals or from an already constituted society. It's a sort of intermediate realm that out of which the individual and the social order are sort of generated. So it's this process of collective individuation that is of interest, and not the already constituted society that he wants to sort of grasp in his notion of collective individuation. Okay, I'm going to suggest that we stop here for today, even though it's a bit early, just because we're at a sort of natural break here, and I haven't read ahead from this point in preparing for these sessions. So if that's okay with everyone, we can stop here for today.
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. So thanks everyone for coming out. We'll pick up on Montesquieu next time, and we have a bit more on a few 18th century authors, and some that are not often read. So some of them I don't really know a lot about, but we'll go through that for the next 10 pages or so, and then we get to the 19th century.
That sounds good. Yeah, thanks, Nan. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.